Views expressed by Casters Guild members are only the opinions of that member, and that could change from day to day. Guild members may use mature language, but that in no way means they are mature. Listener discretion is advised.
From the feel of the cover to the smell of the pages, there's something special about a brand new book. But the older ones will always hold a special place in our hearts. And that's the spell we're casting tonight on Casters Guild. Thank you for tuning into this episode of Casters Guild. I am your guild master and enemy of dog ear, Rick Perry.
And I'm your guild master and resident library thief, Baron Kane.
And joining us tonight are two brand new guild members. Feel free to introduce yourselves.
Hi, everyone. I'm Liz from the Duke and Duchess podcast.
Hi, and I'm Chad from the Duke and Duchess podcast.
And I am not ashamed to admit I have been known to dog ear a book.
Grrr.
It's happened.
I have done naughty things in the stacks, like wiped my boogers on the stacks.
Oof. Look, dog ear isn't that bad as long as you're not cracking the spine. Like that's that's a big pet peeve of mine.
Yeah, I don't get cracking the spine is like, man. Oh, and watching people like fold over comic books.
Oh yeah. Oh no, stop it. Okay. All right. So tonight
I feel like I'm going to have some controversial stances on this podcast.
Tonight we are going to be covering the books that made us geeks. This is a geek culture podcast, and let's be honest, a lot of us who are geeks, it's because we picked up a book at some time and was like, man, this is my shit. So let's start with that question right there. What's the first book that you picked up and read through that made you think, yeah, this fantasy thing, this sci-fi thing, this nerdy, this is my shit, this is my thing? What's the first book that you felt like that with?
Well, my road to geekdom, I guess you would call, is sort of like this 3-act story. I mean, so I'm going to talk for a long time, probably.
Feel free.
Go for it.
You know, I remember in childhood, and I was always an avid reader, and I would come home from the library with, like, you know, books stacked up to my chin, and my mom would be like, you're not going to read all of those, you know, so I can remember in childhood, reading was my thing, and there were definitely sci-fi and fantasy and genre books that I loved, but I don't know, you know, there was, Madeline Langell and C.S. Lewis and all of those classics, but I don't know that I started to really identify as a genre reader, as a nerd reader until really I got introduced to Arthurian fiction in middle school and Mary Stewart's The Crystal Cave series, and that was my first fantasy series that I read that I was like, oh, this is really nerdy, you know. And I kind of want to read nothing else but this. And so for many years, that was my jam. I feel like, though, when I got into The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan, that's when I was like, you know, I feel like this is something that I'm reading that not everybody I know is into. And I feel like when you get to that point, it almost starts to seep into your identity there. You know, this is like, it felt like I was part of a niche versus reading, you know, some of the more just popular literature out there. So that's my journey in 3 acts.
I think my first introduction to fantasy, or the thing that determined that I was going to be a fantasy nerd, actually wasn't a book, even though we will talk a lot about books. I think for me, it was a local tattoo artist. He was a guy who was a friend of my dad's who, you know, was really good at drawing, and he would draw these dragons, and he would just make these amazing, like, dragons and goblins and monsters and things like that. And I was just so stunned that this guy could just create these things from a blank piece of paper. And at the time when I was a kid, like, the thing that everybody was into at the time was like space stuff and cowboy stuff. It was Westerns all throughout my family. And a lot of, like, space stuff. And I was into, like, the Buck Rogers show and stuff like that. But I was definitely not into the Westerns. So I just wanted to go as far away from that as I could. So when I got interested in reading books, it was, I think it was, I don't remember if it was Watership Down or The Hobbit that were the first actual novels that I read. It was one of the two. And then I read The Hobbit, I read Lord of the Rings, I read Mary Stuart's The Crystal Cave, I read Watership Down. I was like, those were the first books that I consumed. The thing that I think really cemented me as being a geek was that I got TSR's first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Unearthed Arcana given to me from a friend. And I was like 11 years, I guess I was about 12 years old, poor as dirt, had no money, had no way to buy the rest of the books, but I really wanted to play Dungeons and Dragons. And I got this book that had all these strange things in it, like 2D10, and I had no idea what that meant. And, you know, all these weird acronyms and stuff. And I had no idea what any of it was because I didn't have the core books. So I just had to invent the core system to fit around what I had in Unearthed Arcana so that I could play the game. If that doesn't make you a geek, I don't know what does.
That's pretty geeky.
Yeah, we often, when I was thinking books that made us geeks, I probably wasn't thinking, players' handbooks or dungeon masters guides or, but like those are books that definitely made a lot of people geeks.
Yeah. I mean, I memorized the second edition player's handbook. I memorized it. I could tell you every stat, I could tell you the weight, range, speed of all the weapons, like a waste of brain space.
That's dedication right there. They did a study to where kids who were my age have a spot in their brains that's like 100% dedicated to memorizing all the names of all the different Pokemon, and that will never go away. And like you can literally do nothing else with that space. It's just locked in there. There's a part of your brain for Pokemon, and like that's probably what you did with that spot in your space. Is just second edition D&D is just locked in there like Pokemon is for me.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I would have to say, by the time I got my hands on any kind of D&D material, I was definitely already a geek. And I would have to say that I would attribute my... And I kind of had something in mind, but I realized I was wrong in what I thought was the first book I picked up that turned me into a geek. It was comic books.
Yeah.
My dad... I don't know if like he thought that he would outgrown them or anything like that, but he was in his 20s. He had a kid and everything like that, and gave me his comic books. So I was very early on a fan of the Incredible Hulk and Spider-Man, and definitely a Marvel kid. And Thor. One of the first comics that I still have, actually, the front cover is Thor fighting Fin Fang Foom. So that was a big deal. And those definitely opened up that world to me. And I would say that, being a comic book geek, that was definitely my thing growing up. But then once I hit middle school is when I got that large box of books from my uncle. And the first book I read out of that book was Dragon's Gold by Piers Anthony and Robert E. Markgraf. And that pretty much opened up the world of fantasy geekdom to me, and it was all downhill from there. There were actually D&D novels in there. There was more fantasy novels in there, and I guess if I was going to nail down what I was in, like if I had to pick a geek world to live in for the rest of my life, it would be fantasy, and it was because of that box o' books.
So, which particular fantasy world, if you had to pick one?
Oh, well, like I said, if I had to live in a world of geekdom, it would be a fantasy, like a bunch of geeks who enjoy fantasy.
Not the question.
No. I'm leading up to that.
Okay, all right.
I would have a hard time choosing a fantasy world because they're all dangerous.
Seriously.
So,
right? Exactly.
But maybe the World of Forgotten Realms. If I had to choose any of them, the magic there seems to be more ingrained, more accessible. Like my favorite D&D world is Dragonlance, but it's essentially a post-apocalyptic world that is in a constant state of war, it seems like. So it's like, no, thank you. No, thank you. I don't want to live there.
This is my biggest problem with like the what fictional world would you ever want to live in question is it's like, first of all, I probably wouldn't be the hero, like, and your average person in most fantasy worlds or fictional worlds in general just get screwed over, and they're all extremely dangerous.
Yeah,
Exactly.
if you're not the hero, you're probably going to get screwed over, and a likelihood of some kind of danger. If you are the hero, it's like 100% danger that you may or may not live through.
Your sister's definitely going to die, or your best friend. One of the
Something.
two. Guaranteed.
I may also choose something that was written by Terry Pratchett.
Good call.
Yeah, that seems like at least might be fun before I die.
I've always said the most dangerous profession in Dungeons and Dragons is parent.
Exactly.
Definitely.
I'm an orphan. Oh, you too. Get in line with all the other orphans.
Mm-hmm. See, this is why, like, the fictional world, like, what fictional world you want to live in, my answer is always Pokemon. Because Pokemon's only dangerous if you read the Pokedex, but the Pokedex was written by 11-year-olds, so I think we're okay.
Yep.
Not the most reliable authors.
I mean, I think I might say The Matrix. Just plug me in, feed me steak.
There you go.
Good.
I do have to say this, Guildmaster Rick. Have you ever seen those articles online where, 10 of the best American cities to live in, and blah, blah.
Right.
We should do one top 10 safest
Fictional
fantasy
worlds.
worlds
Yes.
to live in.
And then you do
Economic
the opposite.
prospects and- yeah.
You do the opposite,
Yeah.
like the 10 the 10 fantasy worlds guaranteed to kill you. Number
Like,
one,
we're not
Hunger Games.
We're not going to Westeros.
Dark Sun.
Oh,
Straight
yeah.
Dark.
Oh, yeah. I mean, oh, man. Dark Sun. Gives me such a creepy feeling.
That was a great fantasy box set.
I definitely see the appeal, but as someone who pretty much lives their life on hope, Dark Sun is not that world for me.
No.
Not much hope.
Might be the darkest setting that Wizard/TSR has ever done.
Yeah, 'cause that was the point of it, was to be like brutal and dark and to be difficult. I've always been a reader since I was really little. I'd say, it all started, of course, like most kids, with like Dr. Seuss and whatnot. It moved on to Goosebumps, which Goosebumps is tempting for me to say what started me off on a geek path, but I was more reading Goosebumps because all the other kids were. There were definitely a couple that I enjoyed, Beast from the East, Jelly Jam, stuff like that. But I think what really did it for me, I talked about it a little bit when we recorded for your podcast. All of our listeners, we recorded for the Duke and Duchess recently. And I talked a little bit about Animorphs. And Animorphs, I think, is what did it for me. It was my first sci-fi thing that I dove in, head first. And for me, when it comes to books, I've always preferred sci-fi over fantasy. Just like movies, I prefer fantasy over sci-fi. I don't know what it is about the mediums, but I've always preferred the sci-fi books over fantasy books. And I really knew that I was a nerd when in Animorphs there were two alien races that were both on Earth. There's the Andalites and the Yeerks. And I got a book that wasn't even part of the Animorph series that was told from the perspective of the Andalites on one of their homeworlds. And like reading through that book, I was like, I don't want anything else in my life. Like, this is it from now on. And I wish I could remember the title of that book, but I read so many of those books, it's impossible to remember at this point. And then I kind of grew from there. A whole lot of Animorphs books from then on. I read through the Chronicles of Narnia. I read through Lord of the Rings. As I've confessed before, I wasn't a huge fan just because of the pacing of it, but what are you going to do? And I think one of the things that brought me over to the adult side from the young readers section, which was, the Animorphs and things like that, there were some Stephen King novels that I read. I'm not sure they're considered geeky, but like The Green Mile was a big one for me. Then I read The Postman and loved that book. And then when I was just starting high school, I was in an inner city school, and the English teacher I had kind of noticed I was way more advanced than the curriculum she had planned. So rather than do the standard curriculum, she was like, pick a book, bring me the book. If I like it, read that book and write me a book report, and we'll consider that your grade. And I wrote her several book reports. I wrote her a couple of the Robotech novels.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, yep. And then the big one was Battlefield Earth.
Oh,
that's awesome.
Interesting card to pull.
Yeah.
And I will say, to all our listeners out there, L. Ron Hubbard is definitely a bit of a quack. That movie was a crapshoot of a movie.
Yeah.
The book was interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely had a good time with the book, while the movie I was just kind of like,
Yeah, there's a lot of subtext in that book, but as long as you're willing to just look past a lot of that subtext and be like, this is just a fun little sci-fi book. It's not bad.
Yeah, which is definitely the spot I was as a freshman in high school. I was definitely not picking up on all of the subtext until
right.
until later on, and I was like, wait a minute. But as a freshman in high school, that was definitely a book that really was like shaped my tastes for a little while, as far as like really digging into sci-fi and fantasy and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And The Postman was probably what shaped my love of post-apocalyptic fiction. So
I love The Postman so much.
Yeah.
And that's one I read in between. I wanted to read a book during the summer, and I read that one between middle school and high school.
I mean, for me, the next sort of like tier, the thing that sort of entrenched it for me, and Baron mentioned it, were the D&D books. I read, at the time, I read all of the Dragonlance books, which I think there were 9 at the time, and now there's like 100 of them. And then I transitioned over to the Forgotten Realms book with Drist and the barbarian dude whose name I can't remember.
You're talking about the Spine of the World series?
Yeah. So I read all of that stuff, and I mean that firmly entrenched in those books. Love them very, very much. And then I got into Dune, but that's a separate conversation we'll come back to.
Something I actually kind of forgot to bring up. When you had mentioned D&D books, and Baron, you mentioned comic books, like I thought about this immediately, and I was like, we aren't just talking about novels, we're talking about everything. When I was really, really young, before I even got into reading books, I spent a lot of time with Sega Genesis video game manuals. Like, some of them I would read more than I actually played the games. Like, I would just, like, read through those over and over and over again. So
Mine was Nintendo Power.
Yep.
Loved me some Nintendo Power. I had the Final Fantasy Nintendo Power, which is essentially just like an entire walkthrough of the entire game. I poured over that thing over and over and over again. It was probably my original Dungeon Master's Guide kind of deal, because I was wanting to run TTRPGs off of it and everything like that. And this is so fun.
I think I had something like that too. Do you guys remember the King's Quest games?
Oh, yeah.
The old Apple II? Yes, I read all of those guides over and over, and just, you want to complete every quest and get every extra point. And I never thought of that as being part of my, part of this story, but it totally is.
Mm-hmm.
Did you play the newest one that came out around like the PlayStation 3 era? I want to say it might have been PlayStation 3, PlayStation 4. Yeah, King Quest 4, I think it was, or they might have just called it King's Quest. But yeah, that one was good. I liked that a lot too.
It was good. I did. I missed the old King's, like the original King's Quest 4 that was still like a text-based sort of, that was just my favorite. And I did find out a couple years ago you can still play those through a website.
Oh, and emulators, yeah. Yep.
Yes, and that just trashed several weekends of my life replaying those games.
That reminds me, I was very late to the video game just because I grew up poor and we just didn't have money for it. So when everybody else had like the old school Nintendo, I got like somebody's old Atari 2600 and a box of games. And I was like, these suckers got Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, but that's all they got. I got I got 14 versions of games that halfway work.
14 versions of Shoot the Dot.
Exactly, yeah. But eventually, when I did get the Nintendo, and the first game I went and spent all this money on was Legend of Zelda, of course, the old school Legend of Zelda, and the disc was like gold plated and it had a book,
Yep.
And you're right, I loved that little damn book.
Mm-hmm.
And part of it was because, it's old school 8-bit Nintendo. So the monsters look like, like little spiky round dots. There's not really a lot you can pick out to them. But in the book,
Yep.
you could see the drawing of what they were actually supposed to look like. And yeah, I poured over that book a lot.
Yeah, so you actually probably know all the names of the actual names of the monsters, how bats are keys and snakes are ropes, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but there they are.
Yeah, at one point I knew them. I don't. That didn't stick around as much as the weapons table in the player's handbook did.
So what about books that were assigned in school? Did anybody have any nerd books that you got to read for a class assignment, other than Rick, who had a really cool English teacher, apparently?
I mean, Huck Finn, Silas Marner was crap.
I will say that in terms of like geek-related stuff, we were assigned the Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of Nim.
Oh, it's such a cool book to be assigned.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Middle school, I believe it was. I wasn't, I don't know what I was expecting because I had already seen, the Rats of Nim cartoon, and I was like, is it going to be like that? And I mean, it kinda, but it was definitely way different than the cartoon. I was very pleasantly surprised. And then I was in honors English in high school, and they gave us a list of books, and they were like, okay, pick from this list of books. And I just kind of asked if I could, instead of reading those books, read other books, and they generally let me do it. But it was is it called the Atom Papers? It's like the Frankenstein, except written from the perspective of the monster.
Mm-hmm.
I picked a few geeky ones. Oh, and Dracula. I got to read Dracula.
Oh, there you go.
There you go.
Yes, classic.
And that one, I was totally off guard. Because, again, I was expecting, I've seen the Boris Karloff. No, not Boris Karloff. Bela Lugosi. I don't think I'd seen the Bram Stoker's Dracula yet, but, I was expecting a narrative.
Mm-hmm.
No, I read journals. It was weird.
Yeah.
But it was well done how it was done. So, but it was fun.
Yeah, the closest I got to that, and I think as I think about it, I think all of this was in 7th grade. So I must have had a cool 7th grade English teacher, although I can't remember who that person is. So sorry, Mrs. But we read a bunch of Edgar Allan Poe. We read a bunch of Greek mythology, where I proceeded to loudly pronounce the name Pope instead of Penelope, because I'd never seen it written before. So Penelope stuck with me as a nickname for a little while. And also we read some like Ray Bradbury, some of the original sci-fi stuff. I feel like there was even an L. Ron Hubbard in there as well. So in
That's
7th
a cool
grade,
teacher.
Yeah,
wish I could remember who that person was.
I don't think I was assigned any genre fiction or given that option until probably senior year of high school. And that was a class that really stuck with me. And 2 of the books I read that year were Handmaid's Tale and The Once and Future King, T.H. White. And just having those books, and this was AP English, so it was the first time I'd been taught to like really dive deep and kind of write on a different level about literature. And that was such a impactful year for me because it had books that I was actually interested in, and I was learning how to like pick them apart. And I was like, oh, this is actually fun. Like if I'd had to do that on some book that I wasn't interested in, it was like, ugh. Way to make reading suck. But when I see, I don't know if you guys have school age kids yet, but my kids come home with these reading lists year after year, and I'm always just a little bummed out. Like, there's good books on there, but I really wish that genre literature had a bigger part in our curriculums. And I don't know if that comes from teacher choice or, this kind of prevailing attitude in academia that genre literature is less serious or what have you. But that's something I really wish I would change. If I was in charge,
Gotta get
that's
involved
what I
in
would
the PTA.
Our PTA doesn't do stuff like that. I don't know. We just sell brownies.
You get enough parents making enough of a stink about it, and the PTA can make a lot of changes. It's just a matter of how much noise you're making.
That's true. I don't know if I have any other nerd parent friends. Do we have nerd parent friends, babe?
Yeah, we definitely do have nerd parent friends.
Sounds like you got the start of a movement there.
Today. A couple of their kids are upstairs right now.
Oh, probably. Yeah, you're right.
When I was in school, I can't think off the top of my head too many books that I was assigned where, like I said, my freshman year, I had that really cool teacher where she was basically just show me a book, and if I approve of it, write a book report. Which, let me be honest, she never said no to any of the books. I think the only reason she said she needed approval was she wanted to make sure that I was picking, novels and not, hop on pop. But I remember a lot in middle school, elementary school, we had the great big textbooks that had excerpts in them. We wouldn't actually get the whole book, but I never read Huckleberry Finn or Tom Sawyer, but we had excerpts from it that we would read aloud in class. I remember reading excerpts of Beowulf in high school, reading through the play A Raisin in the Sun, different poems and things like that. And then I had other teachers that had, the reading list, like Baron was saying, where, pick a book off of this list and do a book report about it. That's actually how I started the Harry Potter series, it was on a reading list.
See, I never got to... I'm sorry, I cut you off. Everybody else's summer reading list and get the Pizza Hut pizza and all this. I never got any of that. I don't know.
Oh, we're bringing up Book It again. Oh, damn.
Yeah, I don't know what neighborhood I grew up in that didn't have a Pizza Hut, but Jesus.
Look, I'm telling you, that's why I'm fat right now. To Book It. I'm telling you.
I'm sorry, Rick. I cut you off.
Oh no, it's fine. The only thing I was going to say, the only book I can remember being assigned, as I'm sure there were more, but the only one I can remember being assigned was To Kill a Mockingbird, which obviously isn't genre fiction, but it was still a great book.
My dumbass, when they were letting us choose books, and I actually chose from the list, chose A Tale of Two Cities.
Boy, you sucker.
I did the same thing. I did the same thing.
Oh, the title made it sound like it might actually be interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, and then, the guy who wrote it, it's oh, well, he's well known.
Mm-hmm.
I've never read any of his books. Everybody likes his books. Let's give it a read. Man, most everybody sucks, apparently.
I ended up...
Sorry to anybody that likes Charles Dickens, but good Lord.
I ended up reading the beginning, skimming the middle, and reading the end, and and faking my way through that book report.
Exactly what I did. Oh no! I can't believe I got a D on it.
I did the same thing with Les Miserables because I loved the musical and I thought the book looked impressive. I was carry it around and look what I have. Mm-hmm. And I did read the whole thing, but it was miserable. And I think it made me depressed for 3 months.
Could see that.
That'll do it to you.
I had that experience.
It's right there in the title, Yeah. Oh, Catcher in the Rye.
Yeah, I had to read The Catcher in the Rye when I was a junior in high school, and I then immediately became sullen and walked around and was like, nobody understands. And I got over it eventually. Last month.
Our high school had one genre of literature, and that was British literature. And I'm like, first off, how white can you be to only have British literature but anyways.
Not just European.
Right.
British.
Right. Just British. But we actually read all of Beowulf And I would argue that British literature would probably be the geekiest of genre literatures, because pretty much anything you're reading in there is going to be like what would be considered like fantasy of today. Most of the British literature stuff is influencing highly fantasy today. But we read Beowulf. We read the Chaucer's, the Chaucer's
Canterbury
Tales.
Tales.
Actually, actually, that is one I read too. Yeah.
Well, first they were like, "Here you go, read it in its original text,"
Oof.
and we're just like, "What are these words? What? It's English." No, it isn't. But yeah, fun fact: if you read Old English out loud, sometimes it sounds like the word it's supposed to be. But yeah, the Canterbury Tales is actually really interesting. I wasn't expecting what I got, so that was fun. And then we read some Lamort d'Arthur.
That's a great one.
I tried to get them to let us watch Excalibur because that was one of my favorite movies, and they were like, "No, we're watching Monty Python and the Quest of the Holy Grail." And I'm like, I've never been disappointed to watch that movie before in my life. But at that time I was. But yeah, so.
I don't want this whole podcast to be like projects from high school, but I remember during my senior year, we read the Canterbury Tales, and then we had to pick one to write a report on, and then they broke us up into groups, and they were like, now write your own tale about a journey. And me and my group, we just decided, you know what, we're going to be pirates. And so we just like completely went off the rails and wrote a pirate story about taking a journey as pirates.
I think we did the same thing, and then the English teacher took my story and put it in a magazine or something like that. He liked me a lot.
And these are like the experiences that like formulated us, though, you know, that
Yeah.
I don't know, it was really for me the early reading experiences, even if I can't remember all of the books I read. And so, you know, you'll come across sometimes a book and you'll be like, I know I read this, but it's like I read it in a fever dream. So I probably read it in like the 6th grade or something. You can weirdly remember it. There are so many of those because it was just a huge volume that I took in compared to what I'm able to read now, you know, but it was part of what became my identity.
Before you move on, in the same vein, have you ever read a book in your early years and then revisited it as an adult?
Oh yeah.
I have a story about that actually.
That's a weird feeling.
I feel like we just all said yes. So like, let's go around, starting with our guests, and we're definitely going to talk about this.
Liz, do you want to go first, or?
I mean, I have a lot of them, for sure, a lot of them. But one that sticks out to me as having forgotten that I read it until I started to reread it was called Enchantress from the Stars. And it was about, oh gosh, now I can't remember the author's name, but it's about this girl from another planet who like comes down to like this primitive world. And, you know, really she has all this advanced technology, but they think that she's a magic user. And it was one of the earliest, probably 3rd or 4th grade, that I originally read this book. And I got halfway through and I was like, why? You know, it just was like just a weird visceral memory I had of sitting in my mom's house. And all of a sudden I was like, oh, I remember that I read this.
So mine, we mentioned it earlier, but is the original Dragonlance Chronicles. I had the big, huge, fat, all 3 volumes in one. That's it. That one right there. So I had that copy of that book, and I read that. I read it right after finishing Lord of the Rings. I went straight into that. Thought it was the best thing I'd ever read. 30 years later, I buy a copy of the book. Actually, like 20 years later, and it sits on the bookshelf for 10 years. But then recently, I reread it with our daughter, and doesn't hold up.
Oof. That's not good news. I just bought all 3 of those books, and I'm like, I'm going to read these. I've never read them. But I'm going to read these books.
If you want a differing opinion, I do believe they hold up. Again, it's my favorite world, and I love the story, so you're good to go.
I love the story as well. So what's interesting about that book is that they were really essentially, I mean, that was the first novel written in an RPG world that existed. And so they were really like figuring it out on the fly. So you can really tell from like not only just from the first book to the third book, even as you're reading the first book, you can see their writing improve and their characterization improve. By the time you get to the third book, it's good. That first book is rough.
I'll keep that in mind as like I try not to give up early. I'll be like, it gets better.
I'm going to say that both Dragon's Gold and The Hobbit were like that. When I was younger, I would, read my books a lot. But then, I've moved to other books, obviously, and I didn't pick up Dragon's Gold for a while. And I read it again. And I remember reading it the first time and seeing it in a particular light. But then after becoming an adult, having experienced my own adult life and, everything else, read that book again, I'm like, oh, man, there's a lot of stuff I missed. Just not really knowing what, how to look at things. By the way, I also remember in 6th grade, they asked me to write a story, and I named my lead character after the lead character in that book, and his name was Kelvin, and she took off a point because I spelled Kevin wrong. yeah, like Kelvin isn't a, unit of measurement, but, whatever. But then The Hobbit was the same way, because I read it, really young. I was really young, and I read The Hobbit, and again, I read it a few times that year and then, kind of set it down. And I didn't come back to it again until after I had already read Lord of the Rings. And then I read The Hobbit again after I read Lord of the Rings. That was crazy. That was crazy seeing, because, you saw some of the references from The Hobbit in the Lord of the Rings. And then it's like it's almost completely different writing styles between The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. And it was just, and it didn't make it worse. It was just interesting to see it in a different light. So, yeah, those are mine.
One of my favorite books of all time is Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and I have read that at 3 points in times in my life, all with different opinions of it. Starting when I was really young, and I just thought it was a really cool sci-fi book, and then later on, when I was a teenager, I was discussing with somebody like books that we really liked, and I was like, yeah, I really like that sci-fi book, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And they're like, yeah, that's a great comedy. And I was like, I don't remember it being a comedy. And so like I had to go back and read it, and I was like, oh my God, this thing is nothing but comedy. What did I think it was? What was I thinking when I was a little kid? But yeah, it's a whole new appreciation for it. And then even recently as an adult, I went back and listened to it on audiobook form with Stephen Fry narrating. And I actually got to do that again, like this past week with my wife on our way to vacation. We listened to that book like on a 11-hour drive. So, and it's even better than when I reread it as a teenager. Just every time I go back and read that book, I appreciate it more.
So I mentioned earlier I want to bring up Dune, as that was one of the series that I read and just spent a huge amount of time in. So one of the things that Liz knows and people who have listened to our podcast know is I'm not a very fast reader. I'm actually a pretty slow reader. So like where Liz reads like 80, 90 books a week, I read them pretty slow, but I tend to digest them and remember them well. I really tried to read the entirety of Dune in chronological order, including not just Frank Herbert, but also his son's books, which meant I had to go through like 9 of Brian's books before I got to any of Frank's books. I will confess I did not make it all the way through, but I read about like 21 different Dune books trying to live in that world. But the whole reason why I got obsessed with Dune was because when I was a kid, I saw the Dune movie, probably earlier than I should have. I saw it like when it came out. I was pretty little at that time, and but I just thought it was the coolest thing in the world. And all my friends were into like Star Wars, and I like Star Wars too. But I always thought Dune was better. I didn't realize, when I was like 9 years old, that movie is not good. So I went and I didn't, I thought I knew the story because I'd watched that movie over and over and over and over and over again, and I thought that's what the story was. It wasn't until I was like 20 years old that I read the original Frank Herbert novel, and I was like, this is nothing like the movie. But that is a phenomenal series that I just absolutely love, and I really steeped myself very, very deeply in that world. It was sort of one of my like coming back to fantasy series because I quit reading fantasy for a long time. I just quit reading genre fiction, or I really just quit reading for pleasure altogether when I got out of college because I read so much in college that I had to read that when I got out of college, I just didn't really have any interest in reading.
Makes sense.
Like I pretty much only read like nonfiction and like manuals. like I didn't read for joy. But then when I got back into it, the two series that I read were A Song of Ice and Fire and 20 of like the 24 different Dune novels.
Now, I do have a question about Dune, and you know, this is obviously isn't a Dune podcast, but I'm not sure if we're going to have a Dune podcast, so might as well get it out now. I was really I even bought a copy of Dune very recently, actually, and then I read how many Dune books there are, which isn't a problem. I read Harry Dresden, so that's the number of books isn't a problem. But I'm seeing that it was never finished. And at some point, they get weird.
Well, I would argue that they're weird from the beginning.
I didn't have a better word for it.
No, it's a good word. It's a good word. So this is my opinion on the Dune series. If you're from an outsider, I would recommend reading from the original Dune to the end of God, Emperor of Dune.
Okay.
That's the first 4 novels. It makes a complete arc.
Okay.
It's as complete an arc as you're going to get.
Mm-hmm.
The son, Brian, finished Frank's book, and although those books are well read, a lot of people really enjoy them. I found them not good.
Well,
so I wouldn't recommend them.
I do feel a bit validated because, again, I've been known to read a book or two. And I was kind of going through the chronology of it and seeing who wrote what and all this stuff. And I believe in my uneducated opinion, I was going to stop at God Emperor God Emperor of Dune. So I feel validated.
Your instinct is good. I will say, in the one sort of nice thing I'll say about Brian, it's Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson, and God love him. A lot of people love Kevin J. Anderson. I'm not trying to criticize the guy. Mm-hmm. I've tried to read a lot of his books, and for whatever reason, I've never been able to finish any of them, with the exception of some of the Dune ones. I just don't like the guy's writing, and I don't know why. It just doesn't jive with me for whatever reason. Even like the Star Wars books that he's written, I was like, I can't get into this.
That's a mess that's a mess I'm probably never going to get into. That's a shit.
That's a ton of books, yeah. But I will say, the first trilogy that they wrote, which is called the Butlerian Jihad.
I'm sorry,
and it's Butlerian Jihad, like Butler.
Oh,
yeah. Oh, you got it. The Butlerian Jihad it's a pretty decent trilogy. There are some things in there that will absolutely make you want to pull your hair out, but 90% of it is pretty good and pretty interesting. I would not recommend reading anything beyond that.
So to kind of rewind a little bit, you said that the second edition books for Dungeons and Dragons were a big influence, I guess you could say. When I started playing Dungeons and Dragons, it was 4th edition, and I did everything I could not to read those books, as much as I loved the game. The 4th edition books were not super well written, in my opinion. Very cold, very dry, very like, this is the rules of the game and this is how it works. Like I would literally, like, to avoid using the book to build a character, like I'd buy character generators for my computer and things like that. But 5th edition,
it was a dark time.
Oh yeah. 5th edition, I think, really hit it really good with their books. I always say that, like, if you want to run a game, like if you want to play Dungeons & Dragons, you need to get, like, the 3 books. Player's Handbook, Dungeon Master's Guide, Monster Manual. But if you're a player, after you get that Player's Handbook, if you're just going to play and never run a game, do not pick up the Dungeon Master's Guide. Do not pick up the Monster Manual unless you really like monsters for some reason. But what you should pick up is the next trilogy, which was Volo's Guide to Monsters, Xanathar's Guide to Everything, and Tasha's Cauldron. those 3 books are so well written. There are large chunks of those books that are written from the perspective of the characters that the title is, the titular characters. They're fantastic, and they're continuing with that with newer books. But that being said, if you are going to pick up those books and you are looking to play some D&D, you're going to need some dice. In which case, I would recommend checking out Geeky Clean, who are proud to present their monthly Dice Bomb subscription box, the ultimate dice goblin enabling service. If you sign up now, the first Dice Bomb you will receive will be July's pineapple, passion fruit, coconut milk, and vanilla sugar scented bath bomb with sandy starfish dice inside. And each month you will receive a carefully curated dice bomb complete with a set of premium resin dice for your TTRP collection. Get 10% off with our link or discount code Guild Decree. But that being said, have you guys had a chance to look through that trilogy of books, the Volos, Xanathars, and Tashas?
We bought them for our son. I don't know, babe, did you look through them at all?
I mean, I looked through them, but I didn't actually read them. You did remind me very much how much I absolutely poured over the original monster manuals from first edition, second edition. But having looked at them, I will say that just the quality of the book itself, from the artwork, and they've always had really good artwork ever since second edition. But the quality of it, the writing, the way the game is, like, they're really good products.
They're not cheap, but I feel like you get your money's worth.
I think fifth edition is and this is coming from a person who played from original Dungeons and Dragons, so that's how old I am. So I will say that this is probably not going to. A lot of people may not agree with me. I think the fifth edition is the best they've ever done. My only knock on them is that all of those books are heavily Forgotten Realms centric, which is cool, makes sense, but Forgotten Realms has kind of just become the generic fantasy world.
Right. I'll say when it comes to Player's Handbook, Dungeon Master's Guide, Monster Manual, and even the other 3 books that I mentioned, those characters are technically Forgotten Realms, but the 3 core books, they don't really do much mention of the Forgotten Realms. It's very just like, these are the rules that you can apply to any setting. And even the Volos, Xanathars, and Tashas, those characters are writing from the perspective of a character in Forgotten Realms, but the rules supplements that are provided can be applied to any setting. And one of the most recent ones was Fizzbands, which obviously is not Forgotten Realms, so they are, kind of branching off. Not to mention,
that's good.
Dragonlance is coming.
That's exciting that they're bringing Dragonlance back.
Yeah, so I think what it just came down to is they knew they had the point of 5th edition was to get new players started playing, and they knew that they were going to be writing a lot of modules for new players, and the easiest way to do that was just to pick a setting and write modules in that setting. So they just picked Forgotten Realms.
Yeah, it's there's certainly nothing wrong with it. I mean, the value of Forgotten Realms is that it does have such a rich lore and history to draw upon. So and this is very different from what it was like when first and second edition came around. When you were reading the books, it was very abstract, which was fine because it was meant to be a game manual. But now when you look at those books, everything feels like it is grounded and it has a world around it, which particularly for people who are trying to jump into it and don't want to create like an entire world and just to be able to jump in the game and run it and play is completely great. And for the people for whom they don't want to inherit a world, it's not really a problem. Discard that. It doesn't get in your way at all.
You could also pick other worlds. I mean, like Matt Mercer's world, Exandria, I believe it's called. Like, hey, he's got plenty of books out now. They got Tal'Dorei, Wildmount. So, like, if you want to pick another world, you can just go pick up those books and pick another. It's completely open source.
And on that note, they just did. Matt Mercer did a GM roundtable with Abria Iyengar and Brendan Lee Mulligan, and that came up with the subject of the worlds and stuff like that. And I mean, I know we're talking about books, but it's subject. Anyways,
We're kind of talking about books now.
So, like, they're talking about one of the big things of, people running in set worlds like that is because they don't want to mess with the lore, or they feel like they're shackled to the lore and stuff like that. And they're like, look, just tell your players at the very beginning, I'm playing my version of Faerun, or I'm playing my version of Wildmount. There's going to be changes. There's going to be differences. It's not canon what I'm doing.
At that point, you can do whatever the hell you want.
Yeah. So if you like the flavor, build your own cone.
I mean, for me, and this all does sort of relate. I don't want to go too, and we probably already have gone too deep into the D&D realm.
Welcome to the Casters Guild. We tend to hop on tangents and just ride them all the way down.
Well, let's keep riding. So for me, I didn't. As I mentioned, when I started playing, I didn't have access to all the books. I had to just make crap up. I had to find a way to play the game with 6-sided dice, and I think I used a deck of cards. I mean, I just made crap up to figure it out, right?
Oh, we were playing Deadlands?
And I didn't have any money to buy, like, the modules or the set, anything like that. The first campaign setting I bought was when I was, like, 21 years old, when I was in the Army. Like, at that point I've been playing for 10 years. And so I just had to make stuff up. But what I often would do, of course, like everybody, is I would take whatever book I was reading and I would start to build like things and stories and worlds around that. And then when I would go to the next book that I was reading, now it would be, that world would twist whatever the other world was. So so I sort of had to just sort of mesh all this stuff together. The interesting part of it now for me is that I have a hard time laying or running pre-written material. I have to run it out of my head because it's just so much easier for me to make things up on the spot than it is to rely on find, source, remember what was written. But I have no problem just riffing.
I think this actually leads me to kind of a cool question. You can go ahead and say what you're going to say, Baron.
Oh,
and then I'll ask my question.
I was just going to say I was lucky enough to be able to run a lot of RPGA stuff and Adventures League stuff, which is all just, here's a module, better do it just like that. So I had a lot of practice doing that. But I will say that I either have to do it by a module, I have to do it like that, or it has to be completely just on a whim. I can't just be handed a book and be like, now go off of the lore. Like, no, I can't. No.
Your 0 prep sessions, I have to say, are pretty good, though.
Oh, thank you.
So, that being said, of books that don't have, TTRPGs written for them, what world would you want to run a TTRPG in?
That's tough because there's a lot of worlds out there that you may not think of that have RPGs written after them, like Song of Ice and Fire, Marvel, etc. So,
Doctor Who.
Yeah.
Who?
What?
While you guys think, I'll go ahead and, since I asked the question, I would want to run one for a Name of the Wind. But
beautiful.
The thing about running that is I never will, because I'd have to create a whole new magic system just for Name of the Wind in order for it to work. At least the way I would want it to work as far as the books go. So, to write an entirely new system for how the magic works, it's just something I'll never do. No matter how much I want to do it, I'm never going to put that much work into it.
I'm gonna say Warbreaker by Brandon Sanderson, which is part of the overall Cosmere, but it's a smaller one. But that would be the one I would most want to run, and I'm pretty darn sure it doesn't exist anywhere else.
Yeah, I would say anything by Brandon Sanderson would be fun to run, but you would have to kind of make up your own sort of spells and for how they work. But what I like about Brandon Sanderson's writing is that his magic systems are so regimented and they're so just meticulously thought out.
I think he's the most game ready.
Yeah, I would agree.
Like his novels almost read like they are video games. Not in a bad way. I mean, in a good way, but like just in the level, the scale, how specific the magic systems are, etc.
I will say, really, any of the books I'd want to play a TTRPG in, I already have. Like even even the Dresden Files. So I will say I have two sources that I would love to turn into a TTRPG. One is the easiest, and that's Red Dragon Inn. It's my favorite board game. It's actually right there. There it is. And then the other one, which I think is going to be, I think would be the most fun and the most creative, would be based off of a cartoon called Craig of the Creek.
Sounds familiar, but I can't quite place it.
Craig of the Creek is about it's a little boy named Craig, and he has like a group of friends, and they all go down to the creek, which is where everybody plays. So they have different groups of kids that play there. So the different
I remember it now. Yeah.
Cool. So they have different kids that play in different areas, and different areas have been built up to those kids' standards, essentially. And like they have maps of the area and stuff. It's really cool. Also, didn't realize this, but it's set in the Baltimore, DC area.
Oh, I didn't know that either.
Yeah.
I'm gonna twist that question, Rick, that you posed.
Oh no.
And I'm gonna say, think about a game, movie, something like that in the fantasy world that does not have a novel, does not have a book associated with it, and what would you like to see?
Well, that's going to be kind of hard because just about every
hard for the same reason that
just about every fantasy movie I bet has a novelization of it.
Mm-hmm.
Like my daughter has the Spider-Man 1, Spider-Man 2 movie novels,
right?
Which didn't know Hank Pym actually showed up in Spider-Man 2.
Oh,
weird.
It is weird. Like a lot of the okay, so like my mind immediately goes to Fallout, but I know there are Fallout books, and then I try to go for something simpler like Mario Brothers, but I also know there are Mario Brothers books. I actually have read them before. They're choose your own adventure style, but I've still read
which is
them.
appropriate.
Yeah, and I think that's a problem as far as like when I try to think of anything I would want a novel written about, like somebody already thought of that and did it.
So I'm pretty sure nobody's ever written a novel about this. It was a video game in I guess it would have been the early 2000s, maybe late 90s. I was absolutely obsessed with called Vagrant Story, and it was nothing ever came of it. It was a great game, but it never went anywhere after that one game.
Yeah,
the story was phenomenal. I would love to see a novel of that world, like that world and that backstory and that world building that was in that. Would love to see something else written about it. But that was the one that came to mind.
I mean, I could go into and just say the same thing that I would love to see turned into a TTRPG. I mean, I would love to see the world of the Red Dragon Inn fleshed out. If you've never played it, have you ever played it before? So it's a board card deck game where you play adventurers who have just come back from adventuring, and you have a sack full of gold and a night free to just get drunk and gamble the night away. So basically you're sitting there with a deck of actions where you can do things to get other people drunker faster than you, and then also initiate a card game to where you can take their gold away. You win if you're the last one standing or the last one with money.
That sounds super fun.
And there are all kinds of characters in this.
Oh yeah.
So it's like this would be a great book series, I think. If they were to do a Red Dragon Inn book series, I would get in hard. If you're listening, Red Dragon Inn people who are, I can't remember, Slugfest Games, I believe?
Yeah.
Slugfest Games. If you're listening, get on it, please.
So
or hire me to write it. I'll take 5 years, but I'll write it.
So which one would you rather have? Would you rather have a series of books written by like the tavern keeper about all the weirdos coming into their tavern, or would you rather have like individual books from the individual characters and things they're doing outside of the tavern?
I think I would like the second one. I don't want... I mean, I would love to read them going to the inn at some point, but I want some books on what they do outside of the inn.
Gotcha.
So give me a narrative of the characters, like even if it was like, oh, this one's written from the perspective of the mage that has Pookie.
Mm-hmm.
He goes out and maybe he hooks up with a few of the other... I would like to think that they... because like I said, oh my god, how many of them are there? 30 characters, probably?
At least.
So I would like to think that maybe, they don't necessarily have a set adventuring group. Or maybe each box set is a set adventuring group. That is actually probably what it is, and that makes a lot of sense. But just maybe even write it about the adventuring groups, Yeah. I think it'd be a lot of fun.
Liz, do you have anything that comes to mind in that area?
No, but you kind of have sent me on another book tangent. Baron, have you read, or have any of you read, the Kings of the Wild book by I believe it's Nicholas Eames? Nobody's read that.
Mm-mm.
I guess the convention of the book is that you have these bands of adventurers, but they're kind of bands, as in like they're as famous as rock stars, and they go around like adventuring, and there's a lot, but it's very, I want to say it's shticky, but it's very funny, it's very tongue in cheek. Like the main characters are like a retired band that are getting the band back together, and you really have like the shield bearer is kind of the drummer, and they, it's all these kind of like little like musical allegories, and but it's definitely, it sounds like something you might like.
Sounds like Devilbird.
Oh. For those who don't know, Devilbird was the name of our adventuring party when we did a actual play on Twitch for D&D. And basically we were a traveling group, like half of our adventuring party was bards, and basically we'd put on shows in different cities. Yeah, it was pretty fantastic.
That's fun.
I've actually always wanted to do a game like that where it was like a traveling bard troupe. I've never gotten the opportunity.
We didn't start out like that. It ended up like that, and it ended up being a lot of fun, and I almost kind of want to do it again with that intention of being like the traveling band, because it was... We could even do it like wow, wait a minute, it did get kind of Partridge Family there for a second, didn't it?
A little bit, yeah.
You guys had like a wagon that you were traveling around in.
Mm-hmm.
Oh man.
Liz, I was thinking about the Kings of the Wild as well, almost going the other direction, as that's a property I'd like to see adapted to another medium, and I could actually see it working well as a video game.
Oh, absolutely. I can see that. I was thinking about any of Scott Lynch's work too.
There's a game that kind of got crapped on by critics, but like I thought was really good, called Brutal Legend. It had Jack Black as your main character, well, voicing the main character, but like he played a character named Eddie Riggs, and he was a roadie that got zapped back in time to like a medieval fantasy land, and like he had to put together a band to take out a demon army. And so,
nothing has been more written for Jack Black.
Yeah. So like,
I wouldn't be surprised if Jack Black wrote it. Let's be real.
Well, it was written by Tim Schafer, Double Fine, but like he definitely probably had Jack Black in mind the whole time.
Right.
It's fantastic. If it sounds interesting at all, you can pick up the game for like $2 now because of how poorly it sold originally, because of how much critics hated it. Fantastic game. But I've always wanted to run a TTRPG based off of Brutal Legend, where like they have different classes that are based off of different members of the band, and like they all have different abilities, or different like crew like all have different abilities, and the boss battles are literally Battle of the Bands, where you put together stage shows and it's your stage against the boss's stage.
We're doing it, Rick.
I've always wanted to run a TTRPG based off of Brutal Legend. It's fantastic. Well, because not only is it just your rock band, it's metal to like the end. Like,
well, of course it is.
You can take literally any piece of landscape in that game, like take a screenshot of it and it looks like a metal cover. Like it's fantastic. Oh, and when you go to buy your upgrades in that game, you buy your upgrades from Ozzy Osbourne, who's the Lord of the Underworld. And like there's a bunch of and he's not it, I don't want to spoil it all, but like there's a bunch of like metal and rock legends who make appearances in that game, and it's fantastic. And so like I think that'll be my answer to your original question. Like if I wanted to see a novel, let's see a Brutal Legend novel, I'd read that. And let's see, I want it to be a novel with a suggested soundtrack. Like when you buy it, like on the back cover is printed a playlist. Like listen to this while you read this book.
During chapter 3, make sure you're listening to Rush. You know?
Mm-hmm.
So Brutal Legend is just an isekai, huh?
Yes, 100%. Well,
they don't have to die.
I would say there's a reason that it's not, but the reason that it's not is a spoiler. So I won't.
Gotcha.
I won't.
Gotcha.
I won't go into it.
It is still the concept is
yes.
isekai. Yeah,
yes.
Okay. Yeah. That's funny. Yeah, I think that'd be a great book series, actually.
Oh yeah. Especially when they go into like the different type, like the different bosses that you fight are all different type of music. The first boss you fight's all about hair metal. And later on you fight the Black Tier Battalion or whatever, and they're like emo rock. And yeah, it's fantastic. I mean, like you could definitely write several books based around the lore that comes from that world.
That sounds like it would make a good graphic novel as well.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, you get the right artist behind it who can draw the right type of art, the right aesthetic that it's going for. When they go for that metal, then yeah, it'd be fantastic.
You know, and when we talk about like books that made us geeks, you know, I think about, because I didn't start reading comics or graphic novels until I was an adult, really. You know, I had never, you know, I'd looked at them and not been that into it. When I was probably in my 30s before I first picked up Brian K. Vaughan's The Last Man. And that series just blew me away, and I feel like it took me to, you know, I'd always thought, yeah, I'm into sci-fi and fantasy, but comics are not my thing. So to find out that there's this whole world of, you know, comics and graphic novels that wasn't anything like what I thought it was before, you know, and then, you know, it was such a neat experience. It took my journey to another place, you know, and then I read all of Brian K. Vaughan's stuff, and, you know, it just kind of opened that world up for me. So I always encourage people, and I have so many friends who are like, yeah, I'm not into comic books. And I'm like, you know, give Fables a try, give that a try. It's an amazing avenue for storytelling.
Yeah, that'd be another great book series too.
Fables, yes.
If you are a fan of the King's Quest series and a fan of Fables, please tell me you've played The Wolf Among Us.
No.
Oh my god, it's a game in the style of the King's Quest game set in that world. You play as Bigby Wolf for the entire game. It's fantastic. Definitely look it up.
I'm actually about to buy it for my daughter.
It's so good. But now that you mention that, I didn't even think about it. The amount of manga that I've read, the amount of manga books that I've read that had to do with like shaping who I am as a geek. And even stuff that might not be considered manga, but definitely graphic novels. You know, like Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, Seconds. And then in manga, you have the Get Backers, Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z, One Piece, Naruto, Fruits Basket, Vampire Knight. The list goes on and on and on. But yeah, the amount of manga that I've read that definitely shaped me as a geek is kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, I find comics interesting because like Liz, I was not really into them as a kid. I just didn't really have access to them because
it's an expensive hobby.
Oh yeah, as a kid, I didn't have access to them. I didn't. I mean, I knew about, you know, Japanimation, but you know, I didn't know about. That's just, I don't call it that now. People don't, you know, come for me in the comments. But yeah, I didn't even know manga existed at all. It's like if I'd known that there was a whole other world of comic books out there when I was younger, what?
Yeah, same. And for whatever reason, and I don't know why this is, I've just never really been into superheroes. I don't know why. So comics also seem so heavily steeped in the superhero thing that it just, even when I got to an age where I had disposable income, just didn't interest me. So when I became aware that like there were all this whole world of comics that didn't have anything to do with superheroes, I started to get really interested in it and find all these other cool things like the Brian K. Vaughan stuff, like Hellboy. I really love Hellboy. What I find really,
I would read some Hellboy novels too.
never read any of the novels, but I would.
I don't know if there are any. I know they're all comic books,
yeah.
but oh
That's
man,
a good question. I don't know. Yeah.
Ooh, I'm going to look into that. Sorry.
Yeah, that
You both
that
are
might be another
inspiring some
candidate.
wonderful thoughts. I'm just like, oh.
What I find really interesting about comics is it as a medium overall, particularly older comic series, is there's this weird dichotomy of being able to do things you couldn't do in a TV show because obviously it's a lot easier to draw and it's cheaper than producing a television show, right? But at the same point in time, you had this weird constraint of like the comics book code, and so that like made these authors have to get really weird sometimes and come up with some off the wall stuff. So you get stuff in comics that you just don't get anywhere else. And also, when I was a young man, the heavy metal comic books were a number one favorite of mine.
Those were pretty cool.
Yeah. I guess it was a magazine. Heavy Metal was the Heavy Metal magazine.
Yeah, but I mean, still had comics, like comics in it and stuff.
Yeah, definitely.
But the thing I liked so much about it was when you got a copy of Heavy Metal magazine, you had no idea what you were in for, and they weren't all always great.
Sure.
But like you just, it was absolutely, you had, as soon as you crack that open, no idea what you're going to get. Anything could happen. And I really can't think of too many other things that were like that.
And it was also kind of cool too, because you would actually get exposed to a lot of artists you wouldn't normally get exposed to. There were a lot of comic book artists that would do stuff in heavy metal where they didn't have those restrictions.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? So they could just jump in there and just really let loose. So yeah, it was really good, really refreshing to see a lot of that stuff as a young teenage male, boobies. So yeah,
it was definitely geared towards our demographic. There's no question about that.
So when you were younger and reading genre fiction and things like that, I mean, let's just be honest, there's a lot of trash out there. Is there anything, do you have any guilty pleasures, anything that is like a garbage novel, but like you were like, I read this when I was younger and I loved this?
Oh, I feel like that's almost sacrilege to answer. Do I have anything on my shelf right now? Watch, I'm going to look.
I mean, I think my guilty pleasure was Heavy Metal magazine.
That's fair.
I think that was my guilty pleasure.
Man, I know I read something. I know I probably enjoyed some bad books or what people
I got one
consider
for
bad
you.
Oh, go ahead.
So, when I was in the Army, one of the things that happens in the Army, particularly when you spend a lot of time in the field, is you run out of shit to read.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody starts handing around whatever books they have. So you end up reading war novels, which I don't know why you would want to read war stuff when you're in the Army, but we did. You read Westerns, you read sports biography, you read whatever the hell there is because you're stuck, in the woods for 7 weeks at a time. So I ended up getting into Anne Rice novels when I was in the Army because somebody had one of those series. And I was like, I guess I'm just going to read this bullshit because I have nothing else to do, and by the end of the third book, I'm like, what happened to Anna,
I mean, that's fair. I started reading Anne Rice when I started dating the woman who would become my wife because Anne Rice is her favorite author in the whole world. We own every book that Anne Rice has ever written. We own every book by her son. So I've read the majority of them. I can't say I've read every. My wife definitely has. The first 3 of the Vampire Chronicles, I think, are where you can stop if you want to read the Vampire Chronicles. Like after you've read the first 3, like you can stop there.
I think that's what I read.
But I think my favorite book by her isn't even part of the Vampire Chronicles, and it's called Servant of the Bones. but it's pretty good. It's about a man who gets through a ritual. His bones he's basically dipped in gold, like molten gold, so his skin and his flesh melts away and his bones become coated in gold, and it becomes a ghost attached to those bones, and he serves whoever has those bones. It's pretty good. But I would say my garbage novels that I got into was between my freshman and sophomore year in high school, I think, during the summer. I discovered the novels of Annette Curtis Klaus, The Silver Kiss, and Blood and Chocolate.
Silver Kiss, yes.
Uh-huh. The Silver Kiss was her vampire novel, and Blood and Chocolate was her werewolf novel.
Red Blood and Chocolate?
I'll be honest with you, it's not great, but my teenage self loved it. I loved both
definitely
of
writing
those
an
books.
R&B song called Blood and Chocolate.
Blood and Chocolate did get turned into a movie later. It was a really bad movie, but
maybe I've seen the movie.
Yeah. Look, the book was bad. The book was still way better than the movie. We'll say that.
Oh, did I?
I unapologetically, like unironically loved those books, and really, went through all things vampire. I would say the worst book I ever actually that I actually legitimately enjoyed while I was reading it were the Twilight books. And I picked those up on vacation one year, and I did tear through them, but with the full knowledge that what I was reading was total crap, and haven't been able to reread them since. But for whatever reason, they just really hit the spot that year. I think I was really sleep deprived. I feel like we'd had a baby.
Yeah, we had a brand new
recently.
child.
And
that's all your brain
know.
was capable of grasping at the time.
That's fair. Yeah, that's a good pick for the question that I asked. The Twilight books, man. Whew.
In the comic realm, I love the comic series Hack and Slash. It's just schlock.
Yeah,
it's like I don't want to even say it was bad, but like it was just kind of pointless, But I loved it.
Sure.
I actually just was going through my comics and found a few. I actually had a they did a crossover with Suicide Girls, the Hack and Slash comics, and I got those again because boobies. But yeah, it was pretty funny how it went down. But I guess if we wanted to get into, because they weren't very well written either, so. But no, I don't think I have any books that I would consider trash if I enjoyed them.
That's fair.
Fair. And I'm not saying that they're not, but I'm having a hard time. It's like, okay, so I like this book. Would this be a bad book?
Can you think of any other books that other people would look at and be like?
Well, that's what I'm trying to think. I guess I don't talk about the books that I love to other people because.
Yeah.
Most of the people I talk to aren't readers or geeks, so I don't get to talk about that stuff very much.
Or in my example, like The Silver Kiss and Blood and Chocolate, you can tell it's written like a trashy romance novel. So like while I still enjoyed it, and I would still say, to me they were good books, like I can understand and look at that and go, that's a trashy romance novel. Like I get
Gotcha. But yeah, I mean, I honestly can't think of it. And this isn't me. You know me. I will throw myself under the bus.
Oh, yeah.
I just honestly can't think of anything.
Sure.
So can I circle us back to something that came up in the very beginning of the podcast?
Let's do
can.
It.
So your well-written, phenomenal opening prelude, alluding to the scent, the feel, the dog-eared page, dog-eared page, however you want to put it. I think I might be in the minority, not just here on the podcast, but in general. I prefer the e-reader.
I mean, as I get older, I prefer audiobooks. Like, I got things to do with my day, and like it's a whole lot easier to consume a book when someone else is reading it to me while I fold laundry.
I will say this. The only reason why I'm not going that route yet was just reaffirmed to me just the other day. And it's funny that you brought that up. I have a friend who does Kindle and got all her books through Barnes and Noble, now all of a sudden they're not supporting Kindle or something along those lines. So her books are gone.
Yeah, I had a similar thing happen to me, so I can understand where that's coming from. But I started out in the Nook Barnes and Noble world. Thankfully, I saw the writing on that wall many years ago, so I switched over because I could see where that business wasn't going to be around for very long. I'm surprised they've stuck it out as long as they have, to be honest with you. And now I don't even read on an e-reader. I did for years. I just read on my phone.
I can do that.
Which I know a lot of people don't like, but I prefer it. I'm a weirdo.
Yeah, I'm just always afraid of something happening to my books to where I will lose access to them. Where, I mean, I guess I could have a house fire at any moment too, and then not have my books. Whereas if someone else had a house fire and they lost their iPad, at least all their books are in the cloud or on their account or something like that. So I guess there are risks either way, but it's like the way I'm looking at it right now is, well, I have my books, but that's not fashion.
I mean, I know I'm weird in this regard. I have books I would like to read that I haven't read because they're only exist in paperback, and I've bought them, and I just, even though I want to read them, I just have a hard time getting around to doing it. So I know I'm weird in that way. They sit in my car because the only time I ever read an actual physical book is when I'm like waiting for a kid outside of a practice.
Well, and I will say that it maybe in this group right here, it may be weird, but I mean, even Rick just said that he listens, that you both are essentially digital book consumers. I mean, I don't know about, the Duchess herself, but I may be the only one that still reads exclusively physical books.
No, I have kind of a strict criteria for what warrants me getting a physical book. I usually will start out a series on an e-reader because I read a pretty large volume, and so it's just not possible for me to have physical copies of all the books that I'd like to have. And I do use the library quite a bit, but there are books that I want to have that I like to reread, because when a new book comes out in a series that I like, I read the whole series leading up to it, so you can really just like get yourself ready for it. But the last series that I had that I liked enough that I wanted to own the physical copy was Naomi Novik's The Last Graduate series. And if you haven't read those, it's a wonderful, like, creepy, dark kind of take on Harry Potter, the sort of magic school trope, but like the school is literally trying to eat the students, and it's all just this like darkness and humor. It's really, really nice. But like I have to like, that's like top tier because I only have like 2 bookshelves to myself, and so if it's going to take space on those shelves,
you only have all the bookshelves to yourself.
The kids have a bookshelf.
I have a box.
A box of scraps.
You do have a box.
And I'm looking at it now. I have a box, and it has a pile of blankets on top of it.
Hey, I have a box of books with a pile of blankets on it as well.
I'll say, I mean, like, I get the whole e-reader thing. One of the only reasons I don't do e-reader is, one, like I said, I have things I have to do throughout the day. So, like, I listen to audiobooks most of the time. I will still sit down and read a physical book if I have the time. But most of the time it's I'm on a road trip, or I'm doing chores around the house, or even I work from home, so I'm sitting at my computer and there's an audiobook playing in the background. My wife, on the other hand, we don't have an e-reader for her because she romanticizes the idea of owning a library. Like, she wants to be Belle. She wants to open a door and, like, see the massive library and, like, someone to go, that's all yours. It's your library. And so, like, we have several bookshelves full of books she has collected over time, and a few she has signed. Like, we have no less than 4 books actually signed by Anne Rice, and, like, others by other authors, which you can't do with, an e-reader. But yeah, I mean, like, that's the biggest reason I don't do e-reader is, one, my wife, if she wants a book, she's going to buy it. So like, we're gonna have a physical copy of it already. And 2, if I am going to be consuming a book digitally, it's going to be an audiobook. I am picky about my narrators, though. Like, whoever is going to be reading that book, I am super picky about the people who are reading that book. Like, I will have books that I want to read, and I literally won't get an audiobook depending on who is reading it. I will wait until I have the time to read that book.
Funny story about that. The Dresden Files has the same narrator through all of the audiobooks, and it's the guy that plays Spike from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I
James
think they
Marsters?
get through. Yes.
Mhm.
I get him and the guy that plays Cyclops mixed up.
James Marsden, yeah.
So it gets all the way to like book 12-ish, I think. It's called Ghost Story. They switch narrators.
That's not cool. You can't do that.
Oh, yeah. There was an uproar. I feel so bad for this dude that narrated that book because they promptly re-narrated it with James Marsters and re-released it. And then he kept doing it. I guess there was like a scheduling conflict and they couldn't get him. So they were just like, well, we're just going to do it with somebody else. And
no.
oh yeah, they released it and people...
Imagine if that was that dude's only gig.
Oh no! I feel
You didn't do
so
anything
bad
wrong.
I would listen to James Marsters just read the phone book. Absolutely.
I'm gonna write a letter to that guy now and just be like, hey man, you did great.
Not your fault, buddy.
Not your fault. Blame your agent. Oh man.
Were there any books that you've come across recently that you weren't expecting to be really good, but then you end up like reading in a single sitting because you can't stop reading it?
I just read one by an author whose previous work, I like to like books. So it's not that it's surprising when I don't like one, but I had read a previous book by this author and it drove me crazy. I hated the main character so much. I hated so much about this book, but I kept hearing about her new work, and the new book is called The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, and the author is V.E. Schwab. And the last book that I had read by her, I absolutely hated, and I don't even know why I picked this up, but so many people kept recommending it to me. And it was fantastic. I tore through it. I stayed up till 3 a.m. reading it the other day just to finish. It's a book about a girl with a curse. It's very kind of like almost old school fairy tale, but it has... I can't recommend it highly enough. It was really good. And I know that her previous work that I couldn't stand, which is called A Darker Shade of Magic, a lot of people really like that too. But I was surprised at how much I did like it, especially since she wrote another female character, and I just really didn't like the way she had written them in the past. She's redeemed herself.
I'm sure she's very happy to hear that.
I'm sure she's rolling in all of her money. Just
exactly, wiping her eyes with $20 bills. I've actually been on kind of a bad run, although I think, unlike Liz, I like to hate books. It's actually not that. It's not coming from that sort of space. But as I mentioned, I'm just a slow reader. Like, I don't know why. I just am. So for me to sit down and read, a 600-page novel or a trilogy, like, it better be good. Like, or else I'm not going to finish it. So I've gotten really good at reading 150 pages and being like, nope, and abandoning it. I've had a bad run, and they're not even necessarily books that I think are not good books, but like Kings of the Wild was one of them for me that just, I read a couple hundred pages of it and I was like, I'm not going to finish this. But I just haven't. I have had a bad spell of books recently. The most recent one that had happened to me was the Priori of the Orange Tree. I read like 2/3 of that book and then just stopped.
That's a good book, but it's not one I would ever recommend for you because it is very slow to start. Have you read Murderbot yet?
Love Murderbot. Actually, you know what? That's my answer. Thank you. That's the best new series I've read recently, and that I did sit down and essentially. Now it's easy to consume them. They're novellas. They're like 100 pages, but I did essentially every time I picked one up, I sat down and read it basically in one setting.
Really consistently good series. Really funny, snappy, good characters.
Baron, do you have one?
I have a problem. If I think I'm not going to like it, I won't read it.
Mm-hmm.
So I can honestly say I've never had a book I thought I wasn't going to like that I ended up enjoying thoroughly.
That's fair.
I think it's even like to the point to where if I feel like I'm not going to like it, I will try to read it and I will just not like it.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's because I don't like
prophecy, kind of.
Yeah. It's and it is a problem because I could totally adjust my mindset and go into this and be like, you know what? I may not like it, but I'm going to give it a chance. But it's still, I go into it. There's been plenty of books that I've read that I'm like, I'm going to love this book. And it's like, I don't like it.
Well, not necessarily like something you thought you weren't going to like, but is there anything that just wasn't what you expected that you end up just...
Now I have to adjust my thinking.
While you do that, I'll go ahead and answer with mine.
Why don't you?
I'm kind of pushing the definition of recent with this, but like a lot of people, around the time this book came out, I was subscribed to Loot Crate, and Ready Player One was included with a Loot Crate. And so I was like, they included a book in this crate. Like, there's a whole ass novel in here. They don't normally do that. So I went ahead and read it, and after I started reading it, I couldn't put it down. I had no idea what to expect out of Ready Player One. But I loved it so much that, like, now when they have, like, bargain copies of it in my local bookstore, because it's easy to pick up a copy of that book for, like, $5 now, because of how many people either got it with Loot Crate and how many more got printed after the movie came out. I'll pick up a couple copies. Like, I own 3 copies of Ready Player One right now, just because anyone I come across who hasn't read it, I'll just give them a copy and just be like, hey, this is yours now. Don't worry about returning it. This is your copy of Ready Player One. Go ahead and read that.
I did actually have an example of that with a graphic novel as well that I didn't expect to happen. And it's what's his name? Craig? Guy wrote Blankets, but he wrote a book called Hattori, and I don't even remember how I ended up stumbling across it. But I read that. It's a big one too. It's like a 300-page graphic novel, and it was really, really beautiful. Not the best ending. Like, great book, not a great ending, but still really worth it. I would still recommend folks read it. And I have another twist or another question after Baron goes.
Yeah, I will say this. Since I will say I didn't really know what to expect from this book. It came highly recommended, but I was also told it was like a fantasy novel with like no magic. So I'm like, what? I don't know how this is going to work. But
does not compute.
It is The False Prince, Jennifer Nielsen. I started reading it, and again, couldn't put it down. I got 3 books. Like, well, I think they're mine. I think she let me have them. But I pretty much read the entire series of 3 that I got in like a week. I couldn't put them down. Killed them. Really, really good. And like I said, it came recommended, so it was. I knew this person, put some thought into who I am and what I might like. So I was like, okay, I might like him. But I liked it way more than I was expecting I was going to. So, and I will also say that the Dresden Files was also another one for me. Not that I didn't think I was going to like it, but I watched the TV show first. And the first episode is called Stormfront. The first book is called Stormfront. And I read the book, and I had watched the first book, and I'm like, oh, cool. It follows it pretty much, but, this was a TV show, and this is a book. They can do a lot more. But then I noticed that the second episode was not named Full Moon. And I was like, okay. I read that book, and it blew me away. Was not expecting it. And, it maybe slight spoilers. It's all about werewolves. All about werewolves. I'm a werewolf fan. And this had like 5 different kinds of werewolves in it. Not just 5 different werewolves, 5 different kinds of werewolves. And I was like, oh, I can't not. I've read that book again by itself without going back to the first one, just because I loved it so much. So yeah, so those are my examples.
So you kind of reminded me of a similar thing that happened to me, but I'm going to ask this question, and I'll give a brief example. And I know we're running long here, so but I'm going to ask if has anybody ever read a book that was simultaneously amazing and also completely dreadful at the same time? And here is my example. I read it's a duology, and I think it's like a duology and then another duology. But I read the first two books of Hyperion, which I know is highly regarded, and I hated it. However, there is one chapter, and it is a long ass chapter. It's like a 65-page chapter. It is one of the most beautiful things I've ever read in my entire life. I think it's the only time I've ever cried in a novel. And I just don't cry in books. I cry in movies all the time. I just don't cry at books. Like one of the most amazing chapters, incredibly beautiful, like short story if you take it out of this book. Just amazing. Surrounded by a book that I just could not stand every other part of it. I only finished it because that chapter was so, like, the first half of the book was like, okay, all right, it's okay. I got to that chapter, I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. This might be the best book I've ever read in my life. And then I read 500 other pages of absolute shit, hoping that it would pick back up, and it doesn't. There are a lot of people who are going to take issue with that opinion.
But no, not any more than mine, especially considering all the good things I've said about the series. So I guess mine would be The Two Towers. I loved the series. I loved that book, but I hated that book. It is the most slow-paced, but like, and you know, coming back to kind of what you were saying, one of my favorite parts in the series happened in that book, but everything else is just so drug out and so boring, and it's just like I have to get through the, you know what, I even can't even remember half the stuff now because it's just like I need to just get through this so I can get to Return of the King. But yeah, sorry Tolkien people. I love Lord of the Rings. I'll even say that I loved The Two Towers, but you know, only for the Merry and Pippin parts.
I feel kind of bad to say this because compared to its movie, this book is gold. But The Queen of the Damned, when reading that trilogy I was telling you about, obviously the Vampire Chronicles is way bigger than the trilogy, but those first three books, Interview, Queen of the Damned, and Memnoch the Devil, Queen of the Damned was my struggling point. I only finished that book because my wife assured me that like once I got to Memnoch, I would enjoy that a lot more. But there were parts of that book that are extremely cool as far as the lore of the vampires and like the origin story of Lestat and things like that. So, you know, I thought it had parts that I thought were amazing, but very slow read and parts I had to really slog through and force myself to get through.
So the only thing about that book that really got to me was how it seemed like the characters changed. Like they didn't seem like the same characters in this as they were in Interview.
That was intentional though. Cause like,
that's kind of what I'm thinking.
Because in the beginning, they actually explain that because Lestat is your narrator, and he says at the beginning of that book that Louis got so many things wrong. He's like, because Louis is the narrator of Interview, and he's like, that's not how I am. That's not how Louis is. That's not how, like, this is how it actually is. So.
Yeah, for me, I think it's got to be The Dark Tower, Stephen King, and I kind of have that reaction to a lot of Stephen King's writing. Like, I can recognize that it's great. There's stuff about it that I like, but I don't jive with the horror genre at all. And even Stephen King's fantasy stuff has that very like graphic violence and like some disturbing imagery. And so the Dark Tower, the Dark Tower is really amazing in a lot of ways. And I made it through, I think, book 6 of that series, and I won't spoil it, but something happens around book 6 of that series that made me literally go, fuck this book. And I threw it down and I didn't finish it, and people are like, yeah, how could you get that far and not read, you know, but I was, maybe one day I will, but
that was me in Game of Thrones. That series. I got to a certain book and was just like, I can't. And actually, I actually have. I don't know if you ever heard of the Emberverse, but it's the post-apocalyptic thing, right?
Yeah.
Same deal. Love that series. One of my favorite book series ever. I get to a certain point, it's like, okay, we're done. I have not progressed past. There's probably 4 or 5 more books after that part, and it's just like, no, I can't handle it. I don't know. It's just you're so far away from what made me fall in love with you, and it's like, this is a relationship that has gone past its prime, and we need to go see. We need to see other people at this point. So, yeah.
So Baron, before this turns into a 3-hour podcast, you ready to throw a bow on this one?
Yeah. It's gonna be a half-hour bow, though. Is that okay?
You do you.
You do you. So it took a while to get to where we are, both in this podcast and where we are as people. And it has been a lot of adventures along the way. Again, both in real life and on the page. These stories have really helped make us who we are and have really shaped how we interact with this geeky world that we live in. And I would argue that even to today, the books that we are reading are making us the geeks that we will be tomorrow. So just keep reading your books, keep watching your movies, and be a better geek than you were yesterday.
That's awesome.
That's beautiful.
Here.
Chad, Liz, Duke, Duchess, if anybody liked what you had to say and they want to find you anywhere else on the internet, where can they do that?
They can find us on iTunes and Spotify at the Duke and Duchess podcast or the Duke and Duchess Book Club, because I eventually realized that having a podcast name the podcast was redundant. So it's the Duke and Duchess Book Club. And you can essentially find us on all the social medias by looking up the Duke and Duchess podcast, and we will pop up. The best place to hang out and interact with us is on our Facebook group page. It is the Duke. Yeah, you can just look for the Duke and Duchess podcast Facebook group, and you will find us amidst a variety of weird clothes purveyors and, of course, British tabloid websites. We're the only fantasy-based one, so it should be easy to find us.
We'll have all those links in the description below, as well as our affiliates and our featured charity. For those of you who have been following our featured charity, my niece is doing great with her new parts. Like, there's no more signs of rejection by the parts. Everything is going good. She's out of the hospital, so awesome.
That is awesome. We've been following that. Very, very, very excited to hear that.
So, but she still needs your help, so check out that link in the description below. Give what you can. Thank you very much for tuning into this episode of the Casters Guild. Make sure to check us out on all the socials, and we will see you in the next one. Bye-bye, everybody. Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye,
guys.
Bye.
Go.
Bye.